Welcome to episode 116 of the British Broadcasting Century podcast, your moment-by-moment timeline of what happened when in the early days of the BBC. 14th November 1923 is where we are at. It marked 1 year of BBC broadcasting, so they had a bit of a do to celebrate. And so shall we. So spanning the first year of the British Broadcasting Company, previously on the British Broadcasting Century. 14th November 1922, the BBC launches live in London.
2LO Marconi House, London, calling.
With Arthur Burrows delivering a simple news bulletin, once fast and once slow, making the second thing ever on the BBC a repeat. 15th November 1922, Manchester and Birmingham join the fun.
Hello, this is 5IT.
With election results, children's programmes and music. Across the next month, staff are hired, 4 at first, including Arthur Burrows, its first voice, as Director of Programmes. Cecil Lewis from Manchester 2ZY becomes his deputy, and John Reith becomes its first General Manager.
The BBC was in the hands of the wireless trade. They had left me virtually full freedom of management and allowed me to manage the BBC in the interests of broadcasting and of the country.
They function out of one loaned room at Magnet House, racing down the road to the studios at Marconi House in central London. Christmas 1922 brings the BBC's first radio drama, as brought to life in 2025's Christmas radio play, The Truth About Phyllis Twigg.
The British Broadcasting Company now presents our first wireless play, The Truth About Father Christmas, by Mrs. Phyllis M. Twigg, as told by the Fairy Dust Man. Once upon a time, there was a party.
Also the first religious broadcast on the BBC.
It is my privilege, by the aid of the wizardry of Mr. Marconi in this wonderful house, to speak, as I understand, to many thousands of people.
New Year sees pandemonium reigning in the one-room BBC until they move to bigger premises at Savoy Hill, but not before outside broadcasts from Covent Garden's Royal Opera House, an unwise political debate from a nearby theatre.
The atmosphere in the hall was very tense.
The red flag in all its fury and all its glory. And what a row there was about it.
Peter Eckersley joins as chief engineer, helping new stations off the ground from Cardiff.
This is 5WA, the Cardiff station of the British Broadcasting Company calling.
And Glasgow.
Hello, children. Well, it's Tuesday again.
There are Shakespeare plays on the air, Women's Hour, sports reports, daytime concerts, a wireless manhunt, a government inquiry.
Some of the newspapers raised a tremendous racket about monopoly. PMG appointed a committee under Sykes and put me on the committee. I asked him, will you please put me on the committee? And he was criticised for that, but it made an immense difference.
Not everybody's a fan of this Beeb. There's a press ban on listings, a theatre manager's ban on performers, but these just result in in-house listings in the Radio Times and more drama and variety in-house too.
We in the BBC were opposed by almost every sort of opposition that you can imagine.
There's an armistice broadcast, on-air film and music critics.
This is 2LO calling. Now, tonight you're going to hear the first of a series of dramatic criticisms called News and Views of the Theatre by Mr. Archibald Haddon, the BBC dramatic critic.
Hello, playgoers.
New radio stars like John Henry.
The next time there's any experimenting to be done with elephants, I shall not be present.
Simultaneous broadcasting scattering London across the land. And, well, so much to celebrate. Year 1 is done. This time we look at what the BBC did back then to celebrate, including a rather boisterous gang show. I think we've got quite an episode for you this time. It's episode 116 of the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello, I'm Paul Carenza. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being with us on this journey, this moment-by-moment chronology of what happened when in the early days of British broadcasting, which of course doesn't exclusively mean the BBC, but back in those days it generally did. As I speak to you, it's a time of, shall we say, churn at the 2026 BBC, with everything changing from Director General to Strictly Dancers to the Radio 2 breakfast show host. So we go back to simpler times when the Beeb was radio only, and they've been going for just 1 year. Now, speaking of today's BBC, it's worth highlighting now and then, this podcast is not made with today's BBC, it's just about the early BBC. This is an independent podcast. I'm sure you know that by now, but it's nice to say that now and then legally. As regular listeners might know, I do work occasionally on and off the BBC. I'm not a BBC staffer myself. I'm a freelancer. I do some writing for sitcoms and some religious broadcasting. And as I alluded to in the introduction, last Christmas I had a radio drama on Radio 4 called The Truth About Phyllis Twigg, bringing back to life the tale of how drama began on the BBC. And I know one doesn't normally talk about the pitching process and such things, but I thought it's worth mentioning that I've been pitching some more things here in early 2026 and had them largely turned down. So I know it can seem like, Carenza's all busy pitching this and writing that and making the other, but it doesn't always work out that way. I think I've had 8 rejections since the start of the year, including radio documentary. I wanted to make something about the first female broadcaster in Britain, Gertrude Donisthorpe, and also something celebrating the centenary of sport on the BBC. 1927 was the Beeb's year of sport. So I thought, 2027 would be a good time to look back at that. And indeed, 2027 is the centenary of the first DJ on the BBC, Christopher Stone. So that was a pitch I made as well. So each of those went back and forth with a producer, and we threw it into the BBC's latest commissioning round, and, they threw it back again. So be it. But the good thing is that only encourages me more to make more podcasts here. So much as it's nice to have a wider audience there on today's Auntie Beeb, I'm fully aware of their need to be future-facing, youth-focused, and not looking back 100+ years like we like to here. So this is the place for that. But yes, it does come in a season of some other turn-downs, from radio drama I pitched to a TV sitcom I've been developing with a producer. So, a good chunk of this whole writing career is writing for nothing, pitching it out there, and you hope for the best and prepare for the worst. But that is part of the long-term writing career game. But in news of things that are landing, we've got Not Going Out, series 15 of that I've been writing for since the very beginning, and that's filming very, very soon. So that should be on television over the summer. Maybe you even have tickets to go and see the live performances. You can Google and see if you can get in one of the last available tickets for that. I'm doing more daily service quite soon, more Pause for Thoughts with Radio 2 quite soon, and then making this podcast, of course, and trying to get those books over the line as well that people are still nagging me about, including the historical novel all about how the Beeb began, and a biography of Phyllis Twigg. All of that, plus stand-up, my evening at a very old radio tour, which goes to Chelmsford and Weston-super-Mare and Corsham in Wiltshire quite soon. For more information on any of these bits and pieces I'm up to, you can join my mailing list. Link is in the show notes, and I send out about an email a month giving a little summary of what's going on there. Or indeed, find me on Facebook, Paul Carenza, or on Blue Sky, I've got a Paul Carenza page, as well as a British Broadcasting Century page. So follow both. Anyway, that's what's going on professionally for me, or indeed hasn't been going on, depending on those proposals. But what was going on at the early BBC? Should we find out? So this episode of the podcast, we are anchored on 14th November 1923. It's the first birthday of the Beeb, and this was in the Westminster Gazette on the 6th of November 1923, courtesy of our newspaper detective, Andrew Barker. The first anniversary of the broadcasting transmissions from 2LO will be celebrated by the BBC on Wednesday the 14th of November. Speeches will be delivered by Signor Marconi, whose inventions and enterprise have made broadcasting possible, by Mr. J.C.W. Reith, who will give a resume of the year's work, and by Sir Patrick McGrath, President of the Legislative Council of Newfoundland. Yep, no real idea why he was there. I suppose Marconi did make early transmissions to and from Newfoundland. A couple of nights after that, 8th November 1923, they had a Shakespeare night for the 300th birthday of the first folio. That's worth mentioning too. What else in the run-up to the BBC's first birthday there? Well, John Reith mentions in his diaries that it was the 8th of November that he met with the Astronomer Royal and arranged to have time signals taken automatically from Greenwich. Yes, the start of the Pips. All lined up there, ready to start soon after. Reith also mentions the Lord Mayor's banquet that they broadcast the speeches from for the first time, all very successfully, although he does note that his invitation to the banquet unfortunately meant that, to my intense indignation, I'd been put in an overflow room with a few others, so I went home. On the 10th of November, Reith notes that he was looking at expanding the offices at Savoy Hill, moving into a few extra rooms there in the building, and also they had a new studio lined up at Savoy Hill. From Wireless Weekly. Experiments have been made from 2LO in transmitting from a new experimental studio. The feature of this studio is that there is very little elimination of echo. A large number of people have written in to say that they think the new studio is a big advance on the old, so it is possible that more echo will be heard in the transmissions in the future. Also on the 13th November, on the eve of their birthday, I noticed that London 2LO had a talk, How to Become a Dentist, by Mr. Robert Lindsay, Dental Secretary of the British Dental Association. So, I mean, they had lots of talks. Why do I mention that one? Well, isn't it unusual? Robert Lindsay played a dentist on My Family. There you go. And there was an actual Robert Lindsay on how to become a dentist. another behind-the-scenes shift was a change of personnel at the top of the Marconi company. This is Godfrey Isaacs, who we featured many times on this podcast. We've talked about how he was there at the Melba broadcast in June of 1920, how he was the one to initiate the idea of one singular BBC if the Marconi company shared their patents with the other electrical firms. And then indeed Godfrey Isaacs was the director of the BBC itself, so he played a key role in early broadcasting. But as we mentioned a few episodes ago on the podcast, it was at the cost of his health. He was overworked and ready to stop. So November 1923, the Beeb's first anniversary, Godfrey Isaacs thought this would be a good time to retire from the Marconi company and the BBC board itself. And so the night before the BBC's first birthday, it's the 13th of November 1923, and it's time to say farewell to Godfrey Isaacs. A big farewell party at the Savoy Hotel. Also a good chance to raise a glass to Auntie Beeb. Lord Gainford was there, all the BBC board directors, also the old Postmaster General Francis Kellaway. Godfrey Isaacs' son was there, Arthur Burrows, Charles Carpendale, Reith's deputy. Peter Eckersley, of course, chief engineer, Guy Rice, the secretary, Frank Gill, very important part of the early days at the BBC, and a few others, all there to pay tribute to someone without whom I don't know that there would be a BBC, certainly not in the form that we then had. But it wasn't an entirely serious occasion. Reith notes that we put in an exceedingly funny fake news bulletin. To Peter Eckersley's biography then, Prospero's Wireless, written by his son Miles Eckersley, with help from radio historian and friend of the podcast Tim Wonder, it says the engineers fixed up an internal circuit with a visible loudspeaker, and with the amplifier and microphone concealed from view, the show began with Peter, unseen, reading a news bulletin. So there at the Savoy Hotel, they are faking a radio station. And who better to fake it than Peter Eckersley, Arthur Burrows and all of the board directors? Eckersley began saying, "Owing to the intense cold at the opening of the wireless exhibition, which had been on the previous week, the higher portions of Mr. Reith's hat were seen to be covered in snow. This was noticed to slowly melt under the warm influence of the Postmaster General's remarks." Some banter followed for each of the directors, and it was no secret that Peter and Archibald McKinstry of Metropolitan Vickers had not seen eye to eye. In fact, McKinstry of Metrovic and many of the Marconi gang hadn't got off to the best start during the pre-BBC negotiations of 1922. Eckersley used to mock them on the air as if it was a boxing match. And Eckersley continued in that vein here, live and to his face. "It is rumoured that the extension of the offices is taking place at Savoy Hill," which it was. "In order, however, that directors may not transgress the rules about fighting on the premises so clearly defined by Mr. McKinstry, a small boxing booth is being set aside for the needs of certain directors. Mr. Reith is said to have volunteered to be the umpire." All very dry and droll, I'm sure. And there was a live song performed as well, called the 4 PMGs, in front of several. There were 4 Postmasters General involved in the early days of the BBC. They turned over fairly quickly, with changes in government, and no one really wanting the job. So all were lampooned here. The song was written by Eckersley. The singers may have been John Reith, Arthur Burrows, Frank Phillips of the Burndeck Company, and Peter Eckersley with Stanton Jeffries on the piano. We have the words, just not the tune, so, taking it away... "We are 4 PMGs and we're anxious to please, and we settle the laws of the land. We're busy all days like industrious bees, and we think our work was well planned." The first Postmaster General involved was Francis Kellaway, who says, "I made the agreement." The character of Neville Chamberlain then says, "I read it through once." Third PMG was Joynson Hicks. "I formed the committee who knew." And the last one was Worthington. "I worthily read the committee report and I worthily tore it in two." And then they all sing, "And whatever made me do it, I don't know. I shall only live to rue it, what a blow. I had the agreements ratified. Some people won't be satisfied. Whatever made me do it, I don't know." Now, Kellaway was the only Postmaster General that any of the Beeb folks would give the time of day, really. I think he was probably the only one present, but it's difficult to tell. Either way, there were certainly people in the room who didn't get along, and others who were sniggering at their expense. Basil Binion, one of the board directors, and Peter Eckersley came back to Reith's flat, stayed until 1:30 in the morning. They all had a few too many drinks. In fact, John Reith notes that he nearly sat Herbert Parker, the Radio Times editor, as a result of his having had too much to drink at Godfrey Isaacs' farewell do. The next day then, 14th November, with hangovers aplenty, apart from Reith, I'm sure he just had a cup of tea. And that day, off the air, John Reith was made managing director, a promotion from general manager. The board of directors were most grateful for his work. As for what was on the air on the 14th November for the BBC's birthday itself, it was a lunchtime concert from London 2LO with Miss Joyce Beckett on solo violin and Douglas Sharpington gave his baritone voice. Afternoon concert then from Miss Catherine Ulsbrook, contralto at 3:30, and then it's Women's Hour at 5 o'clock. A hockey talk from Mr. H.E. Haslam, and then Making a Home for Miss F. Marie Imant. For children's stories at 5:30 that day, you could hear Uncle Jeff's talk on the orchestra. That's Stanton Jeffries, the musical director of the Beeb. Then you got a break until the 7 o'clock general news bulletin, followed by Mr. Archibald Haddon, the BBC's dramatic critic, sent via simultaneous broadcasting to all stations.
News and views of the theatre by Mr. Archibald Haddon, the BBC dramatic critic.
Hello, playgoers.
There he is. So then at 7:30, the big moment itself, the BBC birthday bonanza. Once again, Peter Eckersley had been at his pen and had written what they called an emergency programme by a distracted staff and orchestra. Apparently, it was one of the only times that John Reith was ever seen to laugh. Yep, Peter Eckersley had started the year as a bit of a bee in his bonnet. Would he ever shut down 2MT Riddle and stop lampooning the BBC?
He came to get my view as to what he ought to do with Riddle. When I said I thought he ought to close it down, he said it was the first time anybody had made any categoric suggestion, and he was very grateful.
Now here he was, bringing his lampooning to the air, and John Reith sniggering away in the corner.
A job well done deserves laughter, not the solemnity of the pompous administrator on top of it. The thing that we do is a God-given thing, for heaven's sake, because it's creative, and it's fun, and it's exciting.
We know that Eckersley was the commentator, Arthur Burrows and other members of the Savoy Hill staff were in the cast, and the script of it I've not seen. I hear it's at the BBC Written Archive Centre. I've not managed to get there lately to try and dig it out. But maybe on a future episode of the podcast, next time I can. There's a long waiting list and access is rather difficult at the minute. Maybe we'll put a link in the show notes to exactly why if you're interested in more on that. And perhaps we'll bring you in future something of that emergency programme by a distracted staff, the Eckersley penned first birthday broadcast. What I do know is that Eckersley conducted the orchestra, broke 2 batons, 2 chairs, the conductor's platform, he upset all the music on the floor, and he finished up with the stub of the baton behind his ear. Cecil Lewis described it as excruciatingly funny, and Reith helpless with uncontrolled laughter.
The BBC was very fortunate to have him as its first chief engineer, and relations between himself and me were always happy and friendly.
Next to speak then on the air was a more serious talk from the man himself, Signor Guglielmo Marconi. We do have a copy of that speech. I'll put a link in the show notes if you'd like to read the full works of what Marconi said on the air for the BBC's first birthday. But here's a little burst of it from Marconi's BBC debut. You'll have to imagine an Italian accent. I gladly accept the invitation of the British Broadcasting Company to speak to listeners in on the first anniversary of the official commencement of broadcasting in Great Britain. Broadcasting constitutes one of the most interesting developments in the science of radio communication. I've watched its rapid growth with great pride. There is every reason to congratulate the British Broadcasting Company on the success which has attended their efforts. I know of hardly any other form of human activity in which such marked progress has been made in so short a time. One of the most interesting early experiments in broadcasting took place in this country in the early months of 1920, when a number of concerts were transmitted from the Marconi wireless station at Chelmsford, and Madame Melba's voice was heard throughout Europe and even in Asia. The insignificant trumpet made, I believe, out of a cigar box, which was fitted over the microphone into which Dame Melba sang, is still preserved at Chelmsford and deserves to rank as an historical souvenir. In appearance, it is a poor thing compared with the microphone into which I am now speaking, but the path of invention is strewn with these apparently small things, which events prove to be of great importance. If you'd like to hear the full works of this speech, I'll record it and put it on our Patreon page. Link to that in the show notes. £5 a month, and you can cancel any time. It all supports this podcast. Here's a small other excerpt, though, of Marconi on the BBC, 14th November 1923. Tonight, the managers of the BBC inform me that important speeches, like those recently delivered by General Smuts and by Lord Curzon, have, thanks to broadcasting, been heard by audiences of at least 2 million persons. If today the voice of a speaker in London can reach every part of the United Kingdom, it will not be very long before British statesmen will be able to address every part of the British Empire. How great a part of an invention such as this may play in binding together great communities. It may be that the time is not far distant when His Majesty the King, on some great occasion like the opening of Parliament, may be heard delivering his address from the throne, not only by the people of these islands, but by millions of the population of Canada, Australia, South Africa, India, and all the scattered possessions of the British Crown. As a writer in the Times said recently, broadcasting has done for human speech what printing did for the written word. Marconi there on the occasion of the BBC's first birthday, and for the complete works of that, see the link in our show notes, you can hear it on Patreon. Marconi has spoken, then Sir Patrick McGrath spoke, President of the Legislative Council of Newfoundland. I couldn't see why. Oh, but look, here is why. Turns out he was the first journalist to report on the success of the Marconi experiments. I've no content of his speech, but that is why he was there. The next day, 15th November, it was Manchester 2ZY's birthday. They didn't seem to make much of a fuss of it. And I wonder if this was because they were a bit hamstrung by now by simultaneous broadcasting and really just having to broadcast a lot of what London had for them. Birmingham also celebrated its birthday on the 15th, but their celebrations were nudged on to the 16th of November, a day late. They had an unusual lecture from Mr. G.W. Kerr called Anticipations, or What Will the World Be Like in 2000 AD, followed by opera solos and then 15 minutes of weekly Morse practice. Well, I'll tell you one thing, Mr. Kerr, the year 2000 AD will not have a weekly Morse practice. Not many opera solos either. Birmingham 5IT did celebrate then on the 16th of November 1923. The Birmingham Evening Dispatch newspaper, and thank you Andrew Barker, the newspaper detective, for sharing this with us, they said, Friday 16th November is birthday night at 5IT, and when you hear the familiar hello, hello, 5IT calling, you may possibly catch a tremolo of excited satisfaction in a familiar voice. The birthday, owing to programme exigencies, will have to be celebrated a night late. The 366th occasion of Birmingham speaking to the world, not with the voice of brazen metal, but with the voice of song and music and good cheer. The paper noted that it had wished nearly 5,000 birthday greetings to little listeners, the number of members of its radio circle, mostly wished by Uncle Edgar.
Lord Reith said to me one day, now, Edgar, you've got a small son, haven't you? I said, yes, I have. He's 5 years old. He said, never forget that there are going to be hundreds of small sons of 5 years old and upwards listening to what you broadcast. Never forget that what you say will remain in their minds for years to come. That was Reith's policy. That's how he saw broadcasting, going into all kinds of homes with all kinds of people.
Uncle Edgar is Mr. Percy Edgar, station director, who for 12 strenuous months has directed activities of 5IT, first at Whitton and since August at New Street. The Birmingham Dispatch, of course, was biased, but they did say that 5IT was the jolliest station of the lot. And think what it has done. Broadcast the Prince's speech from Birmingham Town Hall, broadcast the civic banquet to Mr. Neville Chamberlain, the first station to inaugurate the radio circle for kiddies, first to found a broadcast repertory choir, the first to broadcast a cinema orchestra, and the first to have a broadcast by children.
It would have been so easy to have concentrated our aim upon the lowest common denominators of popular taste, and in doing so to have failed utterly to make the most of our opportunities for enriching the public mind.
They had a special station anniversary burst of music from the 5IT orchestra, excerpts of Bizet's operas, a solo pianist, and a few words of thanks from boss Percy Edgar, Uncle Edgar himself. So that's what Birmingham did to celebrate. We've told you what London did to celebrate, and they did it in style, with Peter Eckersley breaking some chairs, a baton, and several health and safety rules.
That pioneer adventure was born in laughter, was nurtured in laughter, and died in laughter.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Thank you, Andrew Barker, our newspaper detective. Thank you, Tim Wonder. I know that you've contributed in the past to Miles Eckersley's biography, which we dipped into as well. Thank you to the BBC past, present, and why not future, and the Written Archive Centre and the History Department for their preservation of many of these stories as well. But we've got our own way of doing it here. And what will that be next time then? I am preparing for a centenary episode leaping forward to 1926 because it's the centenary of the BBC and the general strike. Massive episode there. Lots to research, write and plan for. So I don't know, maybe we'll get another episode in before that. Maybe we won't. We will see what the next episode is, but look forward to that in May. Support the podcast if you can. Share it, rate, review. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it. The British Broadcasting Century is presented and produced by Paul Carenza. Original music is by Will Farmer. We're nothing to do with the BBC whatsoever. We're just talking about them. Shares welcome, reviews welcome, patrons welcome. Without them, there's no this. We're just here to inform, educate and entertain. And now, of course, on the podcast, Year 2 of the BBC, and indeed leaping forward to the general strike, coming soon on the British Broadcasting Century.